Chapter 13. JD adjusted his dark blue tie in the bathroom mirror. He smoothed his hair back and patted his suit coat one more time. This 10 o'clock meeting could open up an entirely new chapter in his life, one he had been thinking about and working on for a few years now. He took a deep breath and exited the bathroom. The boardroom doors were closed when he arrived, which gave time for the kernel of unease in his stomach to grow. He knew most of the board members, but that didn't mean they would go for his idea. "Lord, send me the words and help them to see," JD whispered as he pulled the door open. A large dark wooden table and 13 black leather chairs were the only pieces of furniture in the almost entirely beige room. The members of the board occupied 12 of the chairs, and JD took a breath as 24 eyes regarded him. He sat in the remaining empty chair at the near end of the table and cleared his throat. "Welcome, members of the board. I know this is a special session, but it's been weighing on my heart, and I feel like now is the time to move forward." The members nodded, telling JD to continue. "As you know, when my father built this company, one of his stipulations for success was that we always try to help those who are in need. As I watch the news each night, I feel like our country is in greater need now than ever before in a lot of areas. But the one that has been on my heart lately is crisis pregnancies. I'm not sure if my father ever told you my story, but I was adopted, and I've been feeling a need to set up a crisis pregnancy center that will specialize in adoption, along with helping pregnant women find resources they need." A few eyebrows went up at this news, but the other faces remained stoic. They were waiting for the details. "My biological mother was too young when she became pregnant with me, and without my father's help, I don't think I'd be here today. He shared God's love with her and helped her find the resources she needed to carry me to term and put me up for adoption." One of the women sniffed and dabbed her eyes. "I sense that God is calling me to be that same voice for other women, and that is why I'm asking for the board to help me fund a pregnancy counseling center in Texas, which I hope will be the first of many to come." Fred, the longest-standing member, leaned forward. With his white hair and bushy beard, he had often reminded JD of Santa Claus. "Why Texas?" JD folded his hands on the tabletop. "Well, as you know, our culture is pretty divided on this issue, and not all places would be welcoming of a center like ours. Texas tends to be one of the more conservative states in that regard, and I'm hopeful that the community there will be more receptive. I'm thinking we could set up our first center in Mesquite, which is outside of the Dallas Metroplex. I believe that location will attract many women, but it's still far enough outside the city limits that I hope the more liberal communities of the Metroplex will leave it alone. I assume you have some specific property in mind?" Terry, another long-term board member, asked as he stroked his dark brown beard. JD nodded. "Yes, I've checked out a few possibilities online and narrowed it down to 3, but I'd like to fly out and inspect them in person. I have contacted a local realtor there, and he's offered to line up showings." "And who will be managing this clinic?" Paul, the youngest board member, inquired. Paul was only a few years older than JD and head of the finance committee, so JD knew he was thinking about the dollar signs. JD drew his shoulders back and let out a deep breath, knowing this could be the make-or-break point. If they didn't feel the company could run without him, they might say no. But he had to chance it as he really felt God calling him to set up the center personally. "I will, at least to begin with. God's plan on that part isn't as clear yet, though I have no doubt he will reveal it in time. You can manage the company while I'm away. You've done a great job so far. So, what do you think?" "Why don't you step outside and give us a minute?" Fred asked. JD's throat dried up. He had known the decision would require a vote, but he had thought he would be there for it. Nodding, he turned and stepped into the hall. The door swung shut behind him, and he leaned his head back against the wall. "I've done my part, Lord. The rest is up to you," he whispered. A feeling of peace covered his head and slowly trickled down the rest of his body. A moment later, the door opened, and Fred motioned him back inside the room. All eyes were trained on him once again as Fred clapped a hand on his shoulder, much like his father used to when he was growing up. "Well, I think I speak for everyone," Fred began, "when I say that your father would be very proud of you, and that we are happy to extend the money you will need for this project." Fred was the first to extend a hand for JD to shake, but the rest of the board members stood and joined the line, voicing their congratulations as well. The final kernel of unease fizzled out, and JD sent a silent prayer of thanks heavenward. When he returned to his apartment that afternoon, the realization of the decision finally hit him. He looked around at everything he was going to have to pack. He had no idea how long it would take to get a center up and running, so he was planning on putting most of his items in storage and moving to Texas, at least temporarily. Of course, he had a few things he had to wrap up here first, including finishing out his current lease, which bought him a couple of months. He hated the thought of losing his rent-controlled apartment, but he was no longer sure New York was where he was supposed to be. Even before he had met Callie, he had been feeling restless, like he was being called elsewhere. But after meeting her, the feeling had intensified. When she had mentioned she lived in Texas, the place where he had often thought of opening his first center, he had thought maybe it was a sign that they were meant for each other. But then her fiancé had re-entered the picture and shattered that dream. He picked up the picture of the two of them he had placed on his bookshelf and perused her face again. Though he knew it was a long shot, he had realized long ago never to assume something was too big for God, and as she kept popping into his mind, he had to assume that their paths would meet again. As I dressed for work the following Monday, I was still smiling and felt lighter than I had in a long time. The meeting with Brent had gone about as good as could be expected, but I had the paper signed now, so he couldn't come back and try to take the child. That in itself gave me a measure of peace, but I'd also gotten the chance to share my story with Lexi over lunch. While Lexi hadn't been convinced she needed Jesus, she had agreed to try church with me the next day. At church, I'd been able to thank Sandra for playing such a pivotal role in my life, and I'd been able to introduce Lexi to her. I didn't know why, but I had this feeling that people who met Sandra eventually accepted Jesus. She just had this air about her. Sandra, ever the enigmatic one, had smiled and given the credit to God, but I knew my decision had given her heart some joy. My life was not turning out the way I had planned, but I was pretty content with where it was going so far. The only regret I had was JD. I couldn't change the past, but I now believed that prayer could change lives, and so every morning and every evening, I prayed for God to send JD back into my life. I spared a look in the hall mirror on my way out the door and smiled at the change I saw even in myself. "Well, what happened to you?" Tina asked as I approached the desk. My smile deepened at the thought that my transformation was so evident. "Follow me into my office and I'll tell you." Tina's brow rose, her curiosity piqued. With the door shut, I spilled the story of my trip, my breakup, and my pregnancy, ending with my acceptance of Jesus into my heart. "Oh, Callie, I'm so excited for you. I've been praying for you since I started working here." Tina wiped tears from her eyes. My eyes widened. "You have?" "Of course," Tina nodded. "I want you to be in heaven with me when I get there. I had an all-night prayer vigil with the Lord the night I suspected your pregnancy. I was concerned you were so focused on your career that you would choose an abortion." I blinked as Tina's words sank in. I can't believe how close I came to doing just that. And I can't believe how many people were praying for me when I didn't even know what was happening. I hope I too can become a prayer warrior like you and the others who have been praying for me. "I think God has big things in store for you, Callie," Tina smiled. "Now tell me more about this handsome man you met there." I sighed. I wish I could, but I never even got his last name. I messed that up so badly. "Don't worry about it. I thought I had messed things up when I first met Gary, my husband. I told him I wasn't interested and tried to date his best friend. He ended up moving across the country. But eventually he came back, and God brought us back together. I think if you are patient, you'll find that God can do anything. Just remember to pray about it and be open to God's prompting." I nodded and hugged the assistant, who was quickly becoming a friend. Next on my list was Lexi. Though she had gone to church, I could tell she still wasn't ready. I'd call her today and see if she wanted to do lunch again. With that settled, I sat down and faced the pile of work on my desk.